Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 23rd paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being Weather. The text follows: still more rarely has the weather any decisive influence, and it is mostly only by fogs that it plays a part. So that's it. It's possibly the shortest paragraph ever we have read up to now in the Vom Kriege. As always, I say this chapter is short, is longer, whatever, but it's always very important. Well, it is actually. I mean, okay, not extremely important in the whole structure of the work, but still significant, right? Especially when considered together with the previous two, right? The ones on locality, time of the day, and now the weather, that are those circumstances which always attend the application of the means in war, right? And that have to be considered when we think of a theory of the art of war, right? And by essentially stressing not what is, eliminable for some reason that we don't really understand, given we're talking about reality, but something in fact that is always present and that we can therefore take into consideration, especially in these cases, right? Because they always happen. Like these three factors are always there, right? They can have a different intensity in absolute terms, as well as a different relative value for the way they influence the armed forces, right? But they're always there, hence they can't be discarded. Right. But there is a sort of hierarchy of importance in them, in the measure they on average, right? We're talking about average here, impact on the armed forces. This concept of average, I stress it because it's very, very, very important, right? As we've seen, a positive theory of the art of war is not possible. What we have to do with we can create a theory of the art of war, but not for making it applicable in every single circumstance. We have to, however, be aware of those factors that are there, that are most likely there. And in this case, like in these three elements, locality, time of day, and weather, are always there. Like they never disappear. So whatever you do, doesn't matter, what kind of army, kind of operation you're doing, whatever. These three factors are always there, and they always influence the outcome of combat, right? So, and there is a hierarchy in which objectively locality is the most important and the weather is the least important, right? On average, I stress it, which is kind of more evident. Like you can argue that the locality literally determines how fast you have, like how much in the first place you have to move your armored forces as a physical mass across the same battlefield, along the same country, etc. So the time of the day is something important overall that is mostly tied to essentially visibility, right? I think that here von Clausewitz doesn't specify it, but it's obvious that even, different temperature that you experience between day and night is more part of the weather than the action. So naturally, all these factors are interdependent because it's obvious that even the terrain, if it rains, it's something different, right? But so even here, you're acquainted with the extremely concretely oriented, let's say, von Clausewitz mentality. Here, it doesn't matter to analyze up to the very last datum how these factors interact. We just know that they are there. They are somewhat fairly self-evident, right? Physically speaking, and at least in their physical relations with the armed forces, and they are there, and you can consider that will make a difference, right? But as we were saying before, if you have to take your troops up to a hill, that makes a lot of difference on average, more than whether you're doing it during the night and during the day, right? The time of the day, as we have seen in the last video on it actually, is more. It's not just about the visibility, but what that entails also. Behaviorally, psychologically speaking, we can say, because we do know that humans behave differently like other animals, of course, during the day and during the night, right? And we are made to live chiefly during the day, right? At night we sleep, but at the same time, as we observed in that paragraph, like, and of course, as I was saying, I mean, it's a matter of at night you see less, your senses are kind of more disoriented, and you tend to be more scared, right? So that's important. That's as important as it can be, for example, entering combat before or after having eaten, for example. It may seem trivial, but actually it's not. We do have different reactions by many factors, right? In this case, we're listing the ones that never disappear, right? The fact that day and night alternate is not a matter of opinion. It does happen, right? And even if you were into space, like there would be an equivalent of it, because of course, you darkness and light do make a difference in that sense. They're not that they're not connected to the Earth rotation, but cycle, but it's something else that produces the same effects, right, in different measures. So that can be important, cannot be important. It all depends on which factors these are combined, right? But definitely the least important probably is weather, right? And I suspect that in here from Clausewitz is actually also thinking in statistical terms, meaning that at one point, which I don't remember actually in the Vom Kriege, but we will read it, he talks about weather conditions, like saying things like, if it rains, most of the times things do not get slowed down, essentially, right? They do, but they're not a massive problem. Actually, they're a very light thing. If it starts snowing heavily, well, that starts being a problem. And in this paragraph, however, he highlights something different. He says basically that still more rarely has the weather any decisive influence, I'm quoting directly, and it is mostly only by fogs that it plays a part, right? So the fog here is, say, I wouldn't say an equivalent of darkness, because it's literally not the same thing, but objectively it impedes your view, right? Sometimes in even worse ways than the night does, telling the truth, because a beautiful moon shining night is definitely better as a time, as a context to find in, than a thick fog we can't even understand, you can't see through, and that there are also acoustic problems related to it, for example, etc. And consider, by the way, that a battlefield, especially at the time of von Clausewitz, was also, let's say, characterized by a sort of artificial fog that was in fact the one of the smoke produced by the musket volleys, right? Musket fire. And that was a real problem. Like up to the end of the 19th century, there was not the technology to dispel this smoke. That, by the way, is also a signaling element for your direction. For example, snipers had it worse at the time because you could see the smoke where they had shot. At least more definitely than we can see today. That is almost invisible at certain distances. And so this is an example that I remember when I read the thing of the rain and of the snow, as I was saying also when we were speaking about the paragraph about the locality, about the ground, the terrain. Struck me a little bit, because I thought that the weather actually was somewhat important, right? I had started to, of course, downsize, let's say, to certain decisive elements conducted by weather. There are those battles when you say, those bows didn't work effectively because it had rained, so it had been raining, so it was humid around, and everybody, oh, that's such an important factor. Well, most of the times actually doesn't make sense, or at least if you don't have any direct influence of it, you can't even speculate on those factors, right? I remember like those things. The Mongols abandoned the conquest of Europe because those years were so rainy. Like, oh well, yeah, it must be such a deep historical realization. It's utter garbage, right? As we were saying, the Mongols invaded Southeast Asia. That was not a particularly dry weather. They invaded Russia in winter. That is not a particularly dry weather. So whether it had rained in Hungary or in Germany didn't make any freaking difference for their bows. That, by the way, they knew pretty well how to keep dry, for that matter. The same thing is the Battle of Waterloo, right? Oh yeah, it had been raining because that was so exceptional. It was caused by the volcanic eruptions down there in the Pacific. It was so strange. Well, no, in Belgium normally in that time of the year it rains, right? So there is actually nothing strange or exceptional in it, right? And yet it's true, of course, that the battleground at Waterloo was softened up by the rain, and Napoleon couldn't enact his favorite artillery tactics of ricochet, against the British lines, and that was an important factor, right, of the battle. So you can see here, for example, that at that point it's more the terrain as a variable, because technically at Waterloo it wasn't raining, right? It had been raining in shortly before, but in that case, you have to combine that specific ground with the weather, right? And that was objectively important. There were a few things that at Waterloo went wrong for Napoleon. Before the battle, actually, because during the battle it got far worse. But even just this one was objectively maybe an important element of the equation that brought to Napoleon's a defeat. Now, I don't know what to add essentially about this weather paragraph, because it's that simple. But just thinking, however, that a person like von Clausewitz, consider that von Clausewitz was one of those people that perfectly knew what it meant to be under the weather in campaign, right? He spent a lifetime in war, so he suffered the effects of weather in its worst ways, and we're not talking just about here. I don't think it's if the temperature is included, but I assume it is, actually, because that's part of the constant variables, right? So it's either, yeah, it's definitely in the weather, because the time of the day doesn't quite either if it has to do with the time of the year as well, but I don't think so. But that's not even the point. But just for saying that, even if certain aspects of the story, like, I don't know, the impress us particularly, like a terrible weather, etc., well, we still see that objectively military operations continue no matter what. So even if indeed individual soldiers suffer because of it, and only they know what sacrifice it takes to do certain things, but at the end of the day, it doesn't change much, right? It's not, if you study, I don't know, Napoleon's Russian campaign, you can see there that, of course, the weather was a variable, but it's absolutely false, historically speaking, that that Napoleon was destroyed by the Russian winter. It didn't happen like that, and they fought like crazy, like around today's, what places are those? Belarus, thinking about the Berezina battle. So all operations, maneuvers, counter maneuvers, marches, counter march, that show you that, yeah, the weather sucked. The terrain also was the one it was. Also the time of day influenced, because certain engagements were fought at night, frozen rivers, this terrible things, right? But crossing rivers in a kind of frozen weather, but still they did it, right? So what here von Clausewitz is actually saying, contrarily to maybe popular opinion, is that yeah, the weather can be discussed in, and it's an important variable, but at the same time it's never as important, for example, as the terrain, not even as the time of the day, right? And this is a realization, I suppose, that has mostly to do, in fact, not just with the single factors that we have listed, locality, time of the day, and weather, but rather with their respective interaction with the rest of the variables that are there in this massively and infinitely complicated system of war, right? So it's as if they amplify the problems in a different manner, right? And we still haven't arrived there, but when we will read the part on attrition, we will understand that, of course, these factors have an impact, but at the same time it's reduced, right, compared to others that we tend to overlook. And I would add this, that von Clausewitz's critique to this, here von Clausewitz is not really criticizing anyone, but let's say that these factors can fit still in those material side of the story that the first military theorists that he criticized were reflecting on, right? Although it's already a bit more advanced. For example, the principle of internal lines, as far as I know, doesn't take into consideration, in fact, not even the ground as such. Like, it speaks mostly in terms of flat lines, right? So leveling every other factor for the sake of what we don't know, like to draw away increasingly from real warfare, right? And therefore just being content of solving a mathematical equation, doesn't seem very useful. So these are still material aspects, right? So it's easy, let's say, to think in terms like, when you think about a battle, you have to think about, I don't know, in which time of the day it's fought, whether it rains or not. But actually, the single most important things are relative to the moral of the army, right? The moral forces as such that are, as we have seen many times in von Clausewitz, literally the definition of what war is, a clash between moral forces, right? So, once again, these factors can interfere, can influence the moral a lot, but it's obvious that all three combined can change, sometimes radically, what is going on a battlefield, the outcome of a clash. But individually, they can't. Most of the times, especially weather and time of the day, do not have this enormous difference, right? Even the locality as such is like, you don't have to pick extreme terrain most of the time. It's also because armies, not surprisingly, tend to fight on terrains that are kind of suitable for them, right? It's obvious that certain troops are kind of trained and specialized in particular terrain, and it's obvious that every armored force has something relative to it. But let's say real big, what certain journalists would call conventional warfare, which doesn't exist as such, is fought in different scenarios that tend to simplify the picture. Like, it's obvious that the terrain does create some advantages and disadvantages that you would prefer to avoid in certain, like to accord your action to. And there is nothing strange, but let's say that armies fundamentally tend to fight on a certain terrain by standard. They tend to stay away from trouble, and from positions that also tend to let's say to bog down their movements, right? Getting on the mountains for an army is not a good idea in general. So it's obvious that most battles are gonna be fought on a flatland, if or something that resembles it, right? If possible. Does this statement make sense? Well, not in On average, it does make sense. Like, then you can find mountain warfare, for example. There are entire fronts that have been characterized by this. But tendentially and preferably, humans also tend to behave like this. And the whole point here is not really setting the grounds for a an ideal landscape, but simply pointing out that at that point, fighting on a flatland or in a mountain is subordinated actually to many other problems, including that are mostly strategical and tactical as well, of course, but that have to do also with a lot of other aspects that are about the political mandate of that military operation and the moral of those troops and many other factors, including, I don't know, banally the quantity, just to stick to a material aspect of the story. But just for saying how at that point these other factors in variables, let's say, in proportion acquire always less importance, and that's where you start understanding quantitatively, dimensionally speaking, let's say, how important or unimportant they can really become, and they mostly become unimportant at one point, right? And this is even more evident when, in fact, you kind of enlarge the scale of this picture. When you fight, like, think about an army, you don't, let's say, a front that is extended on a regional scale. Right. At that point, you don't care whether the individual soldier is fighting on a hilltop or not. Like, at that point, it's really how you deploy your divisions, how the whole, that there are going to be certain geographical features of the terrain that you will have to take into consideration, but they get flattened by other factors, right? And as we were saying, also in many other situations, when there is a clear disadvantage for someone to fight in a certain place, well, chances are, if they have an option not to fight in there, that they will not, right? So that has to do with the reciprocal action side of the story that we have talked about in other previously in the series, Vom Clausewitz, that cannot make you frame combat into pre-established conditions, because normally those conditions are something the enemy reacts to, and that you're in this sense even influenced by, because of the reciprocal laws in the Clausewitzian theory, for which, of course, if the enemy doesn't want to fight on a ground that is unfavorable to him, well, he will behave accordingly, and therefore that directly impacts you, because you are the one who has gone there to try to knock him out. So, and at the same time, that will bounce again back to the enemy, because at that point you will have to find a solution that is always aimed at crushing him in another way, and therefore he will have to respond accordingly. And it's always like this, and actually there is always this constant reciprocity, right, in the relation between the two wrestlers, let's say. So it's really that simple. It's simply, I think these paragraphs are a good exercise to flatten, in fact, those curiosities about particular variables that seem to be so important and overestimated in when we think about war in general, and that at the end of the day they do not make a great difference. If it rains, an army will essentially fight in the same way, even if the sun is shining, right? And there are many other things you should be concerned of that are way more complicated to sort out naturally, and that's why we study war and we make, I don't know, strategic analysis and other stuff, because there is no other way to pretend that a factor like that is actually even worth considering, unless you don't frame it as something much broader where you can't see its relative significance, right? And Okay, so we will go on eventually. I don't have much to tell you, honestly, but I think that there is enough we have said here. Alright, so very short video for this time. Just hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.